Bada bing, bada boom. All right. Hello, everybody, and happy Cocktails and Fishtales Wednesday. We're here with the lovely Tim White and myself, Stina Troyer. We're science specialists for Harbor WildWatch. And as we've been doing digital, virtual Cocktails and Fishtales programs because of the pandemic with you all. So we're excited to have you tuning in on Facebook Live and perhaps watching later on YouTube, but we would love to have your questions and comments as we go through. You can just type those into the chat. I will be monitoring those, and then I'll feed them Tim's way at the end of the presentation. So while you're getting yourself situated and squared away, hopefully enjoying some of this beautiful Washington sunshine or the weather wherever you're tuning in from, we want to ask Tim the most important question. What is your favorite cocktail and biggest fishtail?
Starting right off the bat with the tough questions here, I see. I'd have to say Manhattan is my favorite cocktail, not just to rep my New York roots, but because they're delicious. But tonight I'm out of vermouth, so just rolling with whiskey so far. And biggest fishtail, I'll get into it in the talk, but I have been lucky enough to see some really big great white sharks through the research we've done. So have been really lucky to be standing above 18-foot white sharks cruising underneath our research boat and seeing some very big tails.
Excellent. That is perfect. I thought for sure you were going to bring us back to our research days in Alaska. I do have to give a shout out to the team Ginny. We worked with Ginny Eckert up at University of Alaska. Oh my gosh, it's been too long. Alaska Fairbanks, based in Juneau, whatever that wonderful twirl of words is. But yeah, I thought you were going to tell us about your sunflower star adventures and tagging baby crabs or something. But I'll take a sharkfish tail. That definitely fits. So
great love for the invertebrates, but I took the question very literally, fish tail, so I stuck to those things. I have great love for the sunflower stars.
Yeah, well, now that the Alaska days have passed, you are currently a fisheries scientist at Global Fishing Watch. And it sounds like you get to work with groups across the board, making positive change for all sorts of things, fisheries management and conservation related. And so we're excited to dive in with more of that tonight as you share your presentation with us. So again, for those of you tuning in, let us know your questions in the comments, and I'll be watching those and we'll get those answered at the end, as well as do some kind of Harbor WildWatch updates and upcoming events announcements. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Tim, this rock star of a scientist, to tell us what's going on.
All right, are you seeing it full screen, or am I an amateur and it's...
You're full screen, rocking and rolling.
Shocked. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Stina. Really excited to talk today about some of the work we've been doing tracking fish and fisheries for ocean management. And giant shout out to Stina for being our fearless host of this. We go back, going on a decade or so more right now, when we were essentially housemates living up in Southeast Alaska for a bit. But Stina was also too cool for us and went out into the woods and on awesome islands in Southeast Alaska doing really cool things. So great that we could meet again here. As she mentioned, I'm Tim. I'm a fisheries scientist. So I pretty much spend my time thinking about how we can make sure that fisheries are sustainable and how we can make sure that the species that we all care about, like sharks and tunas, are doing well in the wild. I'm making a tactical mistake right now, showing probably my coolest video first, so it will be all downhill from here, but I wanted to start with a bit about what it looks like to track fish and fisheries. So here I am the dude in the black trying to bring in a very large 16-foot great white shark off the coast of California, where a team of scientists has been studying these animals for years and years and years to try to figure out which parts of the ocean are important for them. So if you want to protect a white shark, where's the right place to do it? And to also ask questions about, how many white sharks are out there? How are they doing? Things like that. So in this video, you see the team trying to bring the great white shark alongside the boat so that we can deploy this electronic tracker on the animal to figure out, again, like where it might be going in the ocean. So here, this is me holding a very long pole with a very expensive tag, electronic tracker on the end of it. And we put the tag in the back of an animal, just harmlessly like an earring. And then that animal carries that tracker for a period of 1 or even 2 years. So scientists can learn where they're going in the ocean. Years of this kind of science from researchers all around the world have taught folks that many sharks and tunas are long distance swimmers. So they might be along the coast of Washington or California for part of the year, but in many cases, these species then make really impressive wild migrations across just shocking distances at sea, where, for instance, the white sharks that I mentioned, they can go hundreds or over 1,000 miles offshore at parts of the year and then come right back alongside our coasts. So I think that this science has been really cool and interesting because it just taught us wild things about what animals do, but also it gave us really important context for how we need to think about, managing and conserving some of these animals. And so what I mean by that is if you care about, say, salmon sharks or blue whales or white sharks, it's very important what you do in your own backyard, but it's also very important to think big picture about, making sure that throughout the whole area where these species are found, that risks are being kind of handled appropriately. So that's some context on how and why we have been tracking fish to pay homage to the Fishtales. And now I'll give a bit of context for what it means to track fishing vessels and why we'd want to do that as well. Fisheries, besides just being like a giant passion of mine and something that I really love, fisheries are so important for our planet because they provide protein for over 3 billion people on Earth. Just a huge percentage of people on this planet really rely on this protein for on fisheries for nourishment and for survival in many cases. In addition to feeding our species' bodies, they also feed our economies, where fisheries contribute to around $150 billion every year. So sustainable fisheries make giant contributions to our planet in terms of keeping our species alive and keeping our economies nourished. But a challenge with fisheries is that there's something known as IUU fishing, or illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, where there's essentially fishing or things kind of illegal fishing or things kind of like illegal fishing cost us around $20 billion each year. So it's really important moving forward that in order to get those benefits from sustainable fisheries, we minimize the impacts from illegal fishing. Done incorrectly, fisheries can also have really harsh adverse impacts on species that we may care about. So one example here, because I often think about sharks and tunas, is that around 75% of open ocean sharks and 30% of tunas are on the IUCN Red List for threatened species. So this is essentially like the intensive care unit for species where, species are added to this threatened list if their populations are dropping and things currently don't look so great. So a pretty high percentage of some open ocean animals are on this list, which means that we may need to take, a few more steps to shore up the management of these species. For context on that, on what those steps currently look like towards, managing fisheries and towards making sure that the impacts on species aren't too severe, a lot of fisheries around the world are managed with fisheries observers. And so this is a picture of me as a much more bearded person on the left here, where I was a fisheries observer in Alaska on the Bering Sea crab fisheries. And so my job would be to go out at sea on these trips and record kind of biological data about what kinds of species the vessels were catching, how big were they, how many, like crab pots were set and crabs were caught, and all that factors into the sustainable management of a fishery. So, and the picture or the video on the right is just one of the gnarlier storms where As a guy from New York who's now spent more and more time at sea, this is definitely the craziest ocean I've ever, had the privilege to witness, with just 20, 30-foot waves, ripping winds, freezing ice all over the vessel. Definitely is not an easy place to work as a fisherman, let alone as an observer, or as an observer, let alone as a fisherman. So from that experience, I know that fisheries observers contribute really powerfully towards the management of sustainable fisheries. But one challenge is that globally around the world, a lot of fisheries don't have access to fisheries observers due to cost or due to just the state of management at that time. So around 2/3 of international shark and tuna fisheries don't have fisheries observers. So they may use other methods to get information on how sustainable that fishery is and what it's currently doing. But in many cases, there's also some holes where there's some unknowns about, say, where exactly fishing is happening, how much of it is occurring, are there any sustainability challenges at hand? So with that in mind, I work for an organization called Global Fishing Watch that is aimed at one of the central goals is to improve the global tracking of fishing effort around our world, so we can make sure that essentially that fishing activity is in line with how governments and people think fishing should be occurring. That nothing's happening out of the usual, or that essentially good actors can be transparently seen and kind of verify that their good behavior is occurring. So to make sense of that, essentially, for a long time, when fishing vessels left side of the coast, if they didn't have like a government tracker on them, it could be a challenge to know where they're fishing and how much they were fishing. And so more recently, because a whole bunch of satellites have been launched over the last 10 years, we've begun tracking fishing boats with this particular kind of transponder. It's known as the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. But for our purposes, it's just a transponder that vessels originally used to avoid collisions at sea. So you ping this AIS signal, and you can see on a screen that other vessels near you are pinging the signal, so you can help avoid collisions. And based on all these satellites that are now orbiting the Earth, we can detect these signals and analyze their tracks to figure out where and when they're fishing. Also, definitely expect whiskey breaks to be taken throughout this talk because it's cocktails and fishtails, so I take open license for that.
Cheers, Tim.
So pretty much we can now see their tracks, and then machine learning algorithms have been developed to parse out what is like transiting behavior, where the vessel is just motoring from A to B, versus what is fishing behavior. And that's done by looking at where the vessel changes its course very frequently, where the vessel changes its speed very frequently, which would indicate something like the vessel is slowing down, putting a net into the water, and then speeding up to go somewhere else. So algorithms now do a really good job with over 95% accuracy identifying where that fishing is occurring. As an organization at Global Fishing Watch, we, in addition to processing those satellite tracks and identifying where we estimate fishing is happening, we then publicly release that information so that the activity of fisheries at sea can be more transparent on our planet. So here's one view of how that looks, where this is a single vessel track going around the Indian Ocean. And you can see these long straight periods where the vessel is motoring from A to B, and also those squiggly zones where the vessel is doing some kind of fishing. I think it's also really fascinating that just from the vessel track, we can not only identify where fishing is occurring, but algorithms can also pick out specifically what kind of fishing that vessel is doing based on differences in the vessel's track. And that's because the movements involved with, say, trawling or longlining look a lot different than the movements involved with purse seining. As you can see here, that trawling, you have a lot of going back and forth at a certain speed. Purse seiners, you often see vessels going in those loops. So this really opens the door for what we can detect at sea and the resolution with which we can map fishing on our planet, where we can now identify for tens of thousands of vessels specifically where they're fishing, when they're fishing, and what kind of fishing they're doing. And this is, again, to link it back to the fish, really important if you're thinking about how can we effectively and sustainably manage fisheries and make sure that impacts on species we may care about, like sharks and tunas, aren't too severe. I made that sound easy, but there's a lot of really hardworking engineers and data scientists at Global Fishing Watch who chug through a massive amount of data every day, where now more and more conservation issues worldwide are being addressed through this lens of big data, where thinking about vessel tracking and AIS, around 300,000 vessels every day are pinging their positions. So you're left with over 50 million messages coming through every day indicating, where a certain boat is. So it's really a big data problem to handle, dealing with all that data, to build the algorithms to make sense of it, and then to walk that data out into the world and begin to try to make policy impacts so folks can make use of this new information. Here's one view of the kind of insights that you get by tracking fishing vessels on our planet. So a few years ago, in a paper led by David Kreutzma, we released this first global observation of fishing on our planet, where from separating all the signals, or from screening from all the signals down to just those signals that indicate fishing activity, you can identify hotspots of fishing on our planet. And with that, you can use that high resolution information to make really informed, data-driven decisions about whether or not that picture of fishing matches what we think the picture of fishing should look like, or what the laws or the regulations say that fishing should look like. To make that a little bit more tangible, here's one view of a marine protected area in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So this green square that you see in the middle was an area that was fished by industrial fisheries, and then it was protected. And so you can see this is before it was protected, all that bright color showing fishing activity. And then afterwards, with this data, you can see vessels leaving the marine protected area where they're no longer allowed to fish. So it's a way to verify that the laws that were put into place, the policies that were put into place, where we say, hey, no more fishing right here, or where they said, hey, no more fishing right here, were being followed by vessels because you could track them leaving those waters. And vessel tracking can also identify when, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, it can identify situations like this, where a vessel was detected fishing illegally inside the marine protected area. And so by having good vessel tracking on that vessel, illegal fishing in this case was identified that resulted in a $2.2 million fine for that company because it was fishing where it shouldn't be. So this isn't always possible. Some vessels, many vessels, in fact, don't use AIS, but this specific technology covers around 50 to 75% of vessels that fish far from land at sea. So you don't get all activity, but you get this kind of new solid subset of overall vessels that are fishing out there. It also, to kind of go forward with that and think about what new things can we do when we have this new high resolution information on where fisheries are operating. We can link it to those shark tracks that the talk started off with, where we have information now in many cases on where sharks and tunas are swimming around at sea, and we can overlap that with this new information on where fisheries are operating, so we can figure out where they're overlapping and whether or not any of that overlap may suggest a conservation issue, or can tell us a bit about which countries are involved with potentially managing that species effectively. For instance, this map here shows where salmon sharks and white sharks overlap with industrial fisheries in the Northeast Pacific Ocean from what we can measure with our vessel tracking approach. And so this information lets us see, for instance, on the left, red colors indicate more intense overlap with fisheries. So we can see that for salmon sharks, most of their overlap is happening in US and Canadian waters. So if we're thinking about how we need to manage salmon sharks and which countries need to be at the table if we're discussing, say, the state of salmon shark populations or the regulations that might pertain to salmon shark harvest, it's kind of a US and Canada thing in these waters, it would seem, versus the white shark. That is an animal that we can see through this view that it has a good bit of overlap with fisheries in international waters. And so when you think about managing white sharks, it's not sufficient for California or for the US to be thinking about white shark management in isolation, because, and not that they necessarily are, but we can see that in many cases, their overlap with fisheries may be happening in international waters. So you need kind of a different group of countries at the table to think about their management, since it's not just the US and Canada thing in that case. So essentially, having this information where they can overlap can inform which countries and regions might be appropriate or might be relevant when you're thinking about their effective management and conservation. The messages, the AIS messages, the vessel tracking messages that we use to map fisheries also include information on which country that fishing vessel is flagged to, or is flagged to, kind of like belongs to, but more is like operating under the umbrella of. And so because you know, or have like a fairly / really good picture of where that vessel is flagged to, which country, you can then look at, you know, which countries are specifically overlapping with different species in different areas. So this bar plot here shows we have all the different species on the left side that we tracked and have, you know, vessel tracking data for, and it shows which countries are overlapping with these different species on the high seas. So the high seas are those international waters that are don't fall under the sole management of any country, but are kind of like the global commons of the oceans, where many nations fish and operate. So what we saw in this particular study is that around five nations drive around 95% of the overlap with these species in the high seas in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, which I think is interesting because it means that, you know, out of the dozens and dozens and dozens of nations that fish in the high seas, if you're thinking about which ones are having the most overlap with some species that we may care about in this part of the ocean, it's a relatively small number. So if you are turning policy levers to perhaps change some things about fishing or think about who needs to be involved in their management, it kind of shrinks down the problem from the entire world and all the countries to a relatively small subset of those countries happening in a relatively small chunk of the ocean. With that, I also will then want to dive down into, we kind of been taking this broad view of super zoomed out, looking at a lot of the Northeast Pacific Ocean, and now we're going to focus in on a much smaller region of this ocean in an island chain that's known as the Line Islands, which is a group of islands around 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. So we're going to see here how tracking fish and how tracking fishing vessels can help us essentially manage the oceans more effectively. I really do like being able to take swigs of whiskey during a scientific talk, and it's going to be really hard to give a talk at like 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. following this.
We appreciate you being here. I also just want to shout out that it's pretty cool that we can have you tuning in from California to give this talk to our folks who are kind of tuning in from everywhere, but we've got some Gig Harbor folks, we've got some Tacoma folks. People are getting pumped, so cheers.
Right cheers. So glad I could be here digitally. So yeah, in this last example, it's focused on this spot in the Line Islands where, surprisingly to many people, one of the world's largest marine protected areas, or, you know, marine sanctuaries where fishing is restricted, is found in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in waters that the United States manages. And it was a spot that was originally created by President Bush, and it was expanded by President Obama. And more recently, the last administration had been looking at whether or not to remove those protections and trying to figure out what effects or impacts that removal of protections would have on the ecosystems here. And these ecosystems were really, or are, some of the most pristine reefs on our planet. So scientists were interested in figuring out what is the value of that protection? What do we get by, you know, not fishing in these really massive parks? These are places the size of France in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where fishing is restricted and ecosystems kind of can run wild. So we're left with the scientific objective of, okay, well, let's figure out, you know, what are those places doing? What does that mean for sharks? What does that mean for tunas? How important are these places to our global heritage? So to shrink down those massive questions into something kind of more narrow and tangible that we could answer with the tools that we had at the time. We were looking at, essentially what does that MPA, that marine protected area or marine sanctuary, what is it doing for gray reef sharks in this case? Because gray reef sharks are one of the most abundant sharks on healthy ecosystems throughout much of the Indo-Pacific. So we started asking some simple questions about, okay, let's track the sharks and figure out how far they travel. And then let's track fishing vessels around these same waters and see, is the sanctuary doing a good job essentially keeping sharks in and keeping fishing out? And what do these views of vessel tracking and shark tracking tell us about that? So to get a handle on those questions, we went down to Palmyra Atoll, which is a protected atoll around 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, and started putting these electronic trackers on gray reef sharks so that they could tell us how far they go from the reef, because we really didn't have too much information on that at all. We knew that because Palmyra was so protected and such a healthy ecosystem, there were tons of gray reef sharks along the reef, but we didn't know if it was important to protect maybe 20 miles offshore or 200 miles offshore for an animal like this. So as you can see here, we caught some animals, we put these satellite tags on the sharks, and then they swam off with an antenna that would ping us their location each time the antenna broke the surface. So kind of in that Jaws moment where you have the dorsal fin along the water's edge and the antenna breaks the surface, satellites then pick that up and will let us know the coordinates of where the animal is. From doing that work, we saw that even reef sharks, which we would have assumed remained pretty close to the reef, swam pretty surprisingly vast distances, with one particular individual swimming over 600 miles from the reef. So a main takeaway from this is that when we're thinking about ocean conservation, for many species, going big could be useful, because smaller parks that try to protect the species might not do such a good job if it's swimming, over 600 miles. So in the context of the last administration's review of boundaries and thinking, hey, can we shrink these marine sanctuary boundaries? This bit of data suggests, hey, you probably don't want to do that if your goal is to protect sharks, because these things can move really far. We then paired that with the view of what fishing looks like in these waters, the view that we got from tracking fishing vessels via satellites again. And so this map here shows the hotspots of fishing effort that we've detected, where the red colors indicate a relatively lot of fishing activity based on what we could detect from satellites, and those colder blue colors represent zero or very little fishing activity that we could detect. So combining the views of where the sharks are with where the fishing vessels are operating, this data suggested that, hey, overall, it looks like sharks and fishing vessels are being kept relatively separate by these protected areas, but you might not necessarily want to remove protections because there are a good bit of fisheries operating outside the protected areas. So the red circle that you see here with a bunch of white dots, that red circle and the white squares surrounding it are protected areas that no fishing is allowed in. And all those white dots are the sharks' movements. If any of that was unclear, the main picture here is just that essentially new technology gives us the power, gives us the data to be able to speak to some really relevant and important policy questions of our times, like should we or should we not remove protections from some of the most pristine ecosystems on the planet? So far, all this is focused on satellites as satellite technology and big data as tools to inform our understanding of our oceans. But I had to pay homage to the fact that I think that those types of approaches can answer really important questions about our planet, but that it's still critically important to have more hands-on, empirical, messy tools to try to understand our oceans, because no one tool is going to be able to answer every question. So with that philosophy in mind, in addition to trying to track fishing vessels using satellites, we also did some work in a country called Kiribati, which is the neighboring islands, that US protected area in the middle of the Pacific, to try to figure out if sharks that were being protected in the US Marine Protected Area were eventually just swimming to neighboring islands and getting captured there. So essentially figuring out if we were only, the royal we being, of course, like this US Marine Protected Area was only protecting sharks for a portion of their time, or were they doing a pretty good job, and were they not getting captured in these neighboring islands that allow fishing too much? So getting there was fairly interesting because for the closest islands to Palmyra Atoll, there isn't, there's not an airport, there's not a defined frequent ferry system you can operate. So I found myself like on the internet looking around for vessels that might be going past some of these islands in the general window that I was trying to get myself to this part of the world. So that was like one of the first things I did for this job, which was a fairly unexpected and interesting process. And after some really random emails and some good luck finding vessels, one of them was willing to, they run passengers across some of these islands every so often. So they're willing to take me to this island, drop me off with a whole bunch of my stuff. So these boxes include all the scientific and field equipment that I would need for a few months stint doing shark research out that way, along with the surfboard. Clearly only brought the critical tools for the job. And then that vessel dropped me with those things, cruised along through other parts of the Pacific for a few months, and picked me up in a few months, which let us ask some interesting questions, I think, about whether or not those sharks were being captured on these islands. And what we saw was that really through a bunch of the markers that we put on sharks at the US protected area, they weren't really showing up in any high rates at all on the neighboring islands. So it was another piece of evidence that we had to say, if your goal is to protect sharks, it looks like this MPA is doing a pretty good job, because we're not seeing, a whole bunch of these sharks get captured in other places. Finally, I know this is Fishtales, but I had to give some shout outs to one of my other favorite species, as Ginny mentioned, or as Stina mentioned, work with Ginny involved crabs previously. And so I just wanted to give a plug that a lot of these giant marine sanctuaries in the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere, though they're focused largely on protecting animals that live in the ocean, they also protect really cool things on land very often, where this is a picture of a coconut crab, which is the world's largest land crab. It is a 3-foot wide crab that walks around rainforests on these atolls and has claws that can crush through bones. So they can bite, around as hard as a pit bull's jaws. And so when you protect a big stretch of the Pacific, very often there's an atoll in the middle of that can harbor some really fascinating and special wildlife. So won't get too far into it, but we'll just say that we tracked these coconut crabs for very similar reasons, to figure out which habitats were most important for these crabs, and got to have some pretty bizarre tagging experiences where after you put the tag in the animal, you had to physically recover it to get the data. So here's me reaching into a log to try to get the tag off of the animal as these, bear traps essentially are flying around this very small, narrow portion of a log. And so doing this let us recover data that would reveal specifically what are the most important habitats to protect if you want to make sure this giant, ridiculous animal is well protected. So that is the talk that I have for us today, but I wanted to leave us on a cheesy message of how technology may play a optimistic role in the future oceans that we may all envision, where my personal view is that I know technology gets criticized a lot for the potential negative impacts it can have on the ocean, but in my eyes, looking at the state of the ocean right now, I have a great deal of optimism, because there's so many solutions that come alongside these new pieces of technology that we couldn't have necessarily even pictured just 10 years ago, where going from not being able to publicly track fishing vessels around the world to now having a really clear view of what's happening at sea allows governments around the world to, I think, make more informed data-driven solutions in ways that makes me optimistic for our oceans. So sometimes the sky is falling, fisheries are terrible approach gets sold to us. But in my personal experience and view, I think we have great reason for optimism. With that, I think I'll just drink some whiskey.
And at this point, typically the crowd goes wild, and we all
never seen it.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's I remember seeing you give a similar presentation at a WSN, Western Society for Naturalists, and being inspired and excited about I don't know, it just seems so that you would track fish and fisheries and kind of overlay that to make better decisions. And so I'm kind of curious, how long has Global Fishing Watch been doing this work? And is it being able to maintain marine protected areas or expand marine sanctuaries? Like how long have you guys been doing that? And what have been some of your like biggest yeehaw successes, do you think?
Yeah, cheers. Global Fishing Watch became an independent NGO in a non-profit in 2017. So we're a pretty new organization. And then it operated for a couple of years as a partnership between Oceana, Google, and SkyTruth. So just going on a handful of years as an independent organization, and to the, I think the middle, I forget the middle part of your question.
How long have you been going, and what are some like great successes?
Okay, yeehaw successes, I believe was the term. That's right.
You got it.
So to me, what's really exciting is so governments around the world have been able to make use of this data set to make better and in some cases different decisions about how they want to manage their waters. And there's, I think, so some of those examples in that list is that I'm really excited about that. A growing number of countries, vessel tracking information has often been thought of as kind of private data. And so even though that data can be really important for managing, shared fisheries effectively, it's sometimes been thought of as kind of like one country has their set of data and the other country has their set of data, and sharing data can be a challenge. But now up to around half a dozen nations worldwide are starting to share their information publicly and put it publicly on the map and make that information available for decisions, which I think is really, really exciting, because I think that kind of cooperation is really necessary for healthy oceans. But more specific little examples within there are that this vessel tracking data has been used directly to help detain illegal fishing vessels at sea when our expertise or data could identify where the vessel is and where it's going. It's also being used by a variety of governments to get a clear picture of what's happening in their waters in near real time. So the yeehaw moments keep me pretty motivated.
Yeah, it is very cool. And I've got some questions flowing in that are kind of touch on some of that as well. But one question from the lovely Howard is, who funds your organization? Where does the funding to do all this cool work come from?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit that is mainly funded by philanthropies. So the DiCaprio Foundation was a really large funder originally. Bloomberg Foundation is a key funder currently, and most of the funding comes from these charitable foundations that are interested in funding us to make this information available to governments and to see this impact continue going forward.
Awesome.
Everything, all the data and the analysis, it's all totally free, and the data that we produce is publicly available. So we're not charging people for it, and we're able to do that based on that generous financial support from charitable foundations.
Awesome. Well, cheers to them. Woohoo! Keep
totally
doing good work. Our executive director, Lindsay, is wondering, as a result of your work at Global Fishing Watch, what policies have you seen put in place to protect fisheries? Which I think is, because fisheries are providing the protein that many people depend on. In addition to protecting the fish, are the fisheries being protected as well, I guess?
Yeah, totally. I think so. Fisheries benefit from transparent views of what's happening, because in one of the ways that fisheries benefit is that when you have a clear picture of what kind of how the fleet is operating, where fisheries are operating, bad actors can often stand out more easily then, where say if someone's doing something very different, or if someone's in a marine protected area they shouldn't be, and they have this vessel tracking or another kind of vessel tracking on, then it makes it easier to detect that illegal activity, and that benefits all the legal fishing, because then they don't have that, illegal fishing kind of leaching resources from the system. And another example of where that's been done was a paper led by Jae-yoon Park at Global Fishing Watch in the last year that looked at one of the largest cases of illegal fishing that's happened in waters near North Korea, where there were hundreds and hundreds of vessels illegally fishing these waters, and through a variety of tracking techniques, that illegal fishing could be identified, which then leads to a reduction in that illegal fishing, because now a spotlight is shined on it and it's common knowledge that it's occurring. So that reduction in illegal fishing activity has important positive impacts on the critical, sustainable legal fisheries that feed our planet.
And kind of a follow-up to that, how about for like when it comes to illegal shark finning? Has that been something your organization's been able to track and maybe put an end to? Because I know it's like over 4,000 sharks an hour, according to some stat that's, I think, conservative, of the species being threatened in that case. But yeah, how's the shark finning situation and your work going?
Yeah, I know there was a case at Global Fishing Watch that I wasn't directly involved in, where folks worked to help support the detainment of a shark finning vessel that was illegally operating in some waters. So there are some examples of shark finning in some cases being linked with other illegal activities that could be tracked via vessel tracking, and so this kind of information can help highlight and reduce that activity. But I personally wasn't involved in that specific one, so I'm sloppy on some of the details for it. So overall, it can, in some cases, highlight it, but I think also for shark finning, some of those vessels might not necessarily, it's hard to track those vessels.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think we have some good questions where we definitely are expecting you to be the expert in all these different species. So
no, I'll tell you if I'm not.
Wondering from Mary if tuna numbers are dropping due to overfishing. And if I'm going to just add a tap onto that, is there a species of tuna you would recommend people consume over other species?
Yeah, so the some tunas are doing surprisingly good, where I saw some recent statistics that like most tuna catch is sustainable in terms of that tuna stocks aren't declining, because there is a great deal of management effort focused on sustainably managing tunas in the form of these like regional fisheries management organizations, where governments will cooperate to try to sustainably manage them. And so the picture for tuna is, for most tunas, is rosier than might be expected in terms of like, these are the stocks that they didn't catch. Like for instance, skipjack tunas around the world are generally considered, in terms of skipjack populations, very sustainable or above sustainability thresholds for maintaining their population size, versus ones like the classic case of Pacific or Atlantic bluefin tuna, where those numbers are a small fraction of what a healthy population would look like. So it definitely is variable by species, but there are sustainable and not sustainable examples out there.
And being that you are in Monterey, I might give a little plug to the Monterey Bay, the Seafood Watch program. I feel like, do they get to partner with your group at all? It seems like that's a perfect, way to, how are these different species of fish being caught, and how are their populations? How are they being caught? Is that an ocean-friendly way to do that? Seems like a good combo there.
Yeah, totally. They do really cool work. So Sina's referencing this Seafood Watch guide that gives some indications for which species and which kind of fisheries are, considered like best choices in terms of their sustainability, or good alternatives or ones that you might want to avoid from a sustainability perspective. So we haven't too directly worked with them yet, but they do super cool things. So there's been some brainstorming about how that might look. So I think there's some very helpful things that could be done.
Cool. That's exciting to hear. Moving on to a fish that rocks, Steve Henry is wondering, it sounds like they've been reading about Soviet Union overfishing the North Pacific in the 1960s and 70s, resulting in devastating effects on rockfish, and is wondering if you have evidence of similar bad national behavior using your tracking data.
I don't know those specifics about that activity related to rockfish. I think that in terms of sustainability for like how vessel tracking contributes to sustainability, often it needs to be, paired with these like stock assessments where folks are, trying to count how many rockfish are out there for different species and whether, how many of them are being caught. So I think the vessel tracking comes in where it can, at times, like provide another view of what that fishing effort looks like, where oftentimes those stock assessments, they may be using like information that's self-reported by nations or fisheries based on where the fishing activity is occurring. And vessel tracking can give you a view to say like, well, to what extent does that view match the view that we can observe this way and look for discrepancies. But that's a long-winded way of saying that specifically with that fishery, I'm not familiar.
That's quite all right. I will put a plug for anyone interested and scuba diver certified. We do monthly rockfish surveys looking for the year of young. So kind of thinking about, that collection of the data of how those populations are doing that can maybe inform other groups. So if you want to come out and count baby rockfish with me, let's go scuba diving. Well, come visit, Tim.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
Another species question. Are you tracking commercial salmon fishing boats?
So some of them get picked up on AIS. A lot of the coastal, so AIS is really good as you get offshore, and it's hit or miss depending on the fishery coastally, where there's size requirements for vessels. There's size requirements for whether or not vessels have to use AIS, and there's also different national requirements where some nations require a really high percentage of fishing boats to use it. Other ones, like in the US, it's around 65 feet or so that fishing vessels should be using AIS above that threshold. So a lot of the smaller salmon boats aren't using AIS. So it's not the best tool for learning about that fishery if you're interested in the smaller ones. But some of the bigger vessels, some of the gill netters, in some places, some seine vessels use it. But like the smaller troller ones, we capture a relatively low percentage of them.
Great. I have one more question from the comments so far. So this, for those of you tuning in, we're getting towards the end. So if you have a burning question, make sure you type it in. So one more to read off of here, but I have a question first. You kind of wrapped up nicely with the coconut crabs. And I know Rachel, our education director, and I, we're out on the beach doing marine education a lot. So tune into our digital beach walks this summer, as well as watch us wrangle the fierce and mighty red rock crab. And I know we like to say we're certified crab wranglers, but you're definitely taking it up a level with the coconut crab. And I'm wondering if you have any tips and tricks for us if we, ever get the honor to come across one of those. How do you avoid those bone-crushing claws?
Oh yeah, that was it's probably a little bit more intense than some of the shark-related activity, because surprisingly, it's the smallest ones that are the trickiest, because they're like so flexible and quick that I'm really scared of the tiny ones. But when the crabs become really big, like 3 feet wide, it's more like a bodybuilder who cannot scratch their back, where you can like hold a particular area of the back of their shell and be relatively safe because they're too big to reach it. So I guess the short answer would be very carefully and by strategically grasping onto certain parts of their shell that they can't reach, and avoiding the little ones as much as possible because they're super flexible and agile.
Beautiful.
Just in case you will come across a 3-foot land crab in downtown Tacoma.
you never know. You never know. They're good things to have in your back pocket, friends. So it looks like, okay, good. We have another question coming in. So I'm going to save, I liked the last one. So Lindsay's wondering, where is your research taking you next, Tim? Just in the, you've got this beautiful like lineage of just kind of these research experiences leading and building into where you are now. But yeah, what's next for you?
Yeah, so far over the last year, the research has taken me to my living room that I'm in right now because of the pandemic, of course. But with an eye towards the future, a lot of the work that we do at Global Fishing Watch is in close partnership with governments that are interested in using this kind of data or that are interested in sharing their own data to make it publicly available. So some of the next trips will probably be to meet with some of those governments that we've been having conversations about digitally over the last year, but that we really just need to sit down in person so we can work through some of those data questions. So increasingly, I am having more time in front of a laptop and less time holding coconut crabs, but I think it's a fair trade overall because it seems worthwhile right now and I'm enjoying it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So our final question to wrap up this evening's presentation is, what is your favorite shark species?
Again, the toughest possible questions of having to pick your favorite sibling or child or something.
It's okay. But we can say no to hierarchies and be like, them all.
I will enforce them. I have a soft spot for white sharks. I think they're awesome. I mean, all sorts of different sharks have wowed me, but especially a 16.
When you say white shark, is that also known as the great white shark? And maybe can you tell us why the name change?
Yeah, it might just be out of laziness to drop that one word. But yeah, totally. I'm talking about great white sharks, where I feel like a lot of great white shark researchers end up using that, maybe just because they say it super often. So they save 30% or 33% of the time by dropping that one. But yeah, whichever one works for sure. Yeah, so great white sharks have that soft spot for me just because some of those images I mentioned of, been lucky enough to see an 18-foot, 2-ton fish just launch completely out of the water and go sideways, 20, 30 feet away and then splash down after a breach. And it just leaves a really strong impression on you.
I will end with a terrible pun and say that sounds awesome.
I never would have come if I knew that this could have happened.
Oh, no. Well, that is at the end. Tim, thank you again so much for virtually joining our Cocktails and Fishtales program. It's a delight to have you and learn more about this really cool work that you're doing through the Global Fishing Watch program. Cheers to them and all of that. And as far as Harbor WildWatch upcoming news, we'll have more great cocktails and fishtales presentations coming to you the third Wednesday of every month, with the exception of July. We're kicking that one to the last Wednesday. But you can stay up to date with all of our events and programs through Facebook as well as our website calendar. If you haven't subscribed to our Wildside Weekly digital newsletter, you can get what's happening a peek at the week once a week through that, as well as if you're a member, you'll be getting our print Wildside newsletter here sometime fairly soon. So big shout out to all our members tuning in and all the people liking and commenting and sharing and posting. We appreciate that support as always. And then last little shout out is that in May, there's the annual Give Big kind of donation fundraiser time. So keep an eye out for some fun programming regarding that. And then tomorrow, of course, is Earth Day. So hope you're all out there celebrating this beautiful planet we live on. And if you need something to do, the Harbor WildWatch staff will be telling some Salish Sea stories. So we've been working together for over 8 years. So you can imagine there's some pretty silly tales from, the heartwarming and inspiring to the really silly, embarrassing. We've got quite the lineup for you all. So we'll be tuning in back on Facebook Live tomorrow at 7 p.m. So if you haven't had enough of us already, tune in for more. But again, Tim, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your great questions and interaction. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Stina. Thanks, everyone. I think your puns are awesome. Appreciate it.
Yes. Cheers to that. And cheers to y'all. Learn to have fun.